A girl stays home alone for just a few hours and then disappears without a trace. No one knows where she went, and her family is left with nothing but questions. For years, the search goes on, with no leads, no answers. But then, 15 years later, something happened that no one saw coming. What they discover shakes them to the core, and the truth turns everything they thought they knew upside down. This is the story of Jessica DeShawn, a quiet teenager from a small town whose life was cut short and whose disappearance left everyone around her wondering what happened. Stick around, because you won't believe the twists this story takes. Before we get started, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. It helps us out and ensures you won't miss any new videos. Your support means everything to us. Jessica DeShawn was born on May 2, 1982, in Shepherdsville, Kentucky. It was a small town where everyone knew each other, the kind of place where you wave at neighbors and kids play outside until the sun sets. Jessica wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was the kind of person you noticed. She was the oldest of 3 kids and took on a lot of responsibility from an early age. While her parents worked hard, Jessica helped take care of her younger brothers. She wasn't just a big sister, she was their second mom. At 17, she had big plans. Jessica worked a part-time job at a local restaurant to save up for her first car. She dreamed of driving around in a red Pontiac, something she worked hard for and finally earned. Her friends described her as funny, easy to talk to, and someone who always had their back. Even though she worked long hours, she still managed to keep her grades up. She had goals. She wanted to go to college and become an accountant. It seemed like she had everything ahead of her. September 10th, 1999, was just another Friday. Like any other school day, Jessica stayed home while her parents went to work. Her younger brothers caught the bus for school, and Jessica was supposed to drive herself to class. Nothing unusual. Her parents didn't think twice as they left that morning. But by noon, something was off. Jessica's car, which should have been parked at school by then, was sitting outside the house. Her mother thought maybe she had slept in or missed the bus. But when she went inside, Jessica wasn't in her room. There was no sign of her anywhere. Her mom called Jessica's dad at work, thinking maybe she'd ask him for a ride, but he confirmed he had left for work alone that morning. A sudden, cold feeling started to creep in. Her mom decided to check on Jessica's car. As she walked toward it, she saw the driver's side door was slightly open. Her heart sank. Inside, there was Jessica's cell phone, still on, with the numbers 9 and 1 on the screen. It looked like she had tried to dial 911 but never finished. Everything else, her shoes, her keys, her purse, was in the car. But where was she? Why had she left everything behind? And how far could she have gone on foot? They lived on the outskirts of town, so walking anywhere was a long stretch. Her parents called the school, only to find out that Jessica never showed up. As the hours passed, their worry grew. Then her best friend from the restaurant called. She was also concerned because Jessica hadn't shown up for her shift. By the time the police were called, Jessica's disappearance seemed like a mystery with no answers. Her parents were desperate for help, but what they got was a sheriff who shrugged it off. He assumed she had just wandered off and would return soon. But how could they explain the open car door, the phone still dialing 911, or the fact that her shoes were left behind? The search continued, but the more Jessica's parents pushed, the more they realized no one was taking their daughter's disappearance seriously. It wasn't until later that day, when they started talking to the neighbors, that things started to feel even more unsettling. They had no idea then that this was just the beginning of a 15-year journey to uncover the truth. Jessica's car was still parked outside their home, which didn't make sense. She should have been at school by now, but there it was, sitting empty. Her phone was still inside, and the screen showed a half-dialed 911 call. Only the call wasn't sent. One of her shoes lay on the passenger seat. Her purse and textbooks were in the back. Everything seemed like she had left in a hurry. But where was she? Why would she leave all her things behind? Her mom checked her bedroom, hoping to find some sign of where she might have gone, but Jessica was nowhere in sight. Her shoes were gone, But her keys, bag, and phone were still in the car as if she had been right there 1 minute and then disappeared. There was no sign of struggle or anything that would explain it. When her parents called the school, they found out Jessica hadn't shown up. She hadn't been marked absent either, and there had been no call to let them know. By now, they were starting to panic. Something wasn't right, and they felt it in their gut. Her best friend from the restaurant called too. Jessica never showed up for her shift. The phone call only deepened their concern. All of Jessica's belongings were still in the car: clothes, books, and phone. A girl doesn't just vanish like that, especially not in a small town where everyone knows everyone. So they called the police. The sheriff listened but didn't seem to take it seriously. "She's probably just off with friends," he said. "She'll turn up soon." That was the sheriff's take on it. No urgency, no investigation, just brushed off like it was a normal teenage tantrum. The family tried to explain that this wasn't like Jessica. She wouldn't just run off. The sheriff, however, didn't see it that way. Hours passed, and Jessica still didn't come home. The sheriff made a quick suggestion to check around the house, but he didn't believe there was any real danger. He didn't think anything was wrong. His attitude left the family frustrated and confused. They couldn't believe how casually the situation was being handled. How could they just sit back and do nothing when their daughter was missing? They knew something was off. They couldn't just wait around. That's when Jessica's parents decided they couldn't rely on the sheriff to help. They reached out to anyone who might have seen something: neighbors, friends, family. But no one knew anything. No one had seen her. They even went door to door asking around. It was becoming more and more clear. There were no answers. Then, the next morning, things took a strange turn. As they were back in their home, trying to figure out what to do next, their son ran inside, claiming he heard a voice calling out for help. He was sure it sounded like Jessica's. Desperate, Jessica's father grabbed his shotgun, ready to do whatever it took to find his daughter. They rushed outside to search, but they weren't prepared for what they found next. The search led them to a neighbor's property, a man named David Brooks. As they approached, they saw smoke rising from his backyard. They walked up, only to find Brooks standing there, burning something. It looked like clothes. Clothes that could have been Jessica's. It was a moment that raised so many more questions. What was he burning? Why was he acting so strange? Jessica's father asked Brooks if they could search his property, but Brooks refused. His reaction didn't sit right with Jessica's family. Before her disappearance, they had a perfectly normal relationship with him. But ever since, he'd been acting differently, driving past their house slowly with an odd smile on his face. It was hard not to feel something was wrong. They even started getting strange phone calls. Silent calls where someone just breathed into the phone. It felt like something was being hidden. Despite the strange situation, the police weren't taking action. Jessica's parents asked them to investigate Brooks's property with cadaver dogs. The dogs did pick up a scent, but nothing substantial was found. They found gloves in one of the sheds, but no real evidence. The police had missed their chance. Nothing had changed, and now the family was more frustrated than ever. They could only continue to search on their own, desperately trying to put the pieces together. As the days passed, Jessica's parents couldn't just sit back and wait for the sheriff to do something. They couldn't. They had to find their daughter. So they took matters into their own hands. They hit the streets, knocking on doors and asking neighbors if they'd seen anything. They asked friends, classmates, and anyone who might know where Jessica had gone. But the town was quiet. No one knew anything. No one had seen anything unusual. It felt like she had vanished into thin air. The hours turned into days, and with each passing moment, the fear in their hearts grew. They were running out of time, and they knew it. The uncertainty, the not knowing. Every minute stretched out longer than the last. They couldn't stop searching. They couldn't let it go. Her mother and her father, they were both determined to find answers. But the more they looked, the more they realized just how little anyone was helping. Then came the strange behavior from people they thought they knew. They started talking to neighbors, trying to see if anyone had noticed something odd or out of place on the day Jessica disappeared. They talked to a few people who had been around that morning, but it wasn't until they spoke to David Brooks that things started to feel more unsettling. Brooks was a neighbor they'd known for years. He'd always seemed like just another guy in the neighborhood, but after Jessica disappeared, his behavior changed. At first, when they asked him about the day Jessica went missing, he was calm, almost too calm. He denied seeing anything or hearing anything unusual. But the more they pressed him, the stranger he acted. He started avoiding them, refusing to make eye contact. He'd stare at them when they walked by his house, but he wouldn't say a word. It didn't sit right with Jessica's parents. They tried talking to others around town, trying to track down anyone who had seen anything unusual, but the pattern remained the same. No one had seen anything. People had no answers. And then, a couple of days later, another strange thing happened. Jessica's father came across a man who claimed he'd seen someone acting suspiciously near the woods. The witness described a man with a dark hoodie who looked out of place. The description didn't exactly match anyone Jessica's family knew, but it was another lead to chase. They couldn't afford to ignore any detail, no matter how small. They found themselves circling back to Brooks. His behavior kept raising questions. After all, why had he acted so strange? Why had he avoided the family when they'd always been friendly neighbors? And when the family noticed that his property was becoming more isolated, more shut off from the rest of the neighborhood, it made them wonder if he was hiding something. The more they dug into his past, the stranger things seemed. Why had he started acting this way? Was it guilt, or something else entirely? Jessica's parents couldn't shake the feeling that Brooks was involved in some way. They started piecing things together. His strange behavior, his reluctance to cooperate, and the way he seemed to avoid eye contact whenever they asked him about Jessica. It wasn't enough to accuse him outright, but it sure felt like there was something they were missing. And then, there was the phone call. Jessica's parents started getting odd calls. No one on the other end, just the sound of heavy breathing. It felt like someone was watching them. The calls never lasted long, and they never heard a voice, but that didn't make it any less unsettling. The calls seemed to come from a blocked number, but they couldn't trace them. Were these calls from Brooks? Or was it someone else? The tension was mounting. It wasn't just about Jessica's disappearance anymore. It was about figuring out who could be trusted and who was hiding something. With every lead that turned up empty, Jessica's family grew more desperate. They had no choice but to keep going. They couldn't stop. The more they looked, the more they realized just how little they knew. They had to dig deeper, ask harder questions, and push until they found something that would lead them to Jessica. It felt like the truth was right there, just out of reach. And the people they thought they could trust? They were acting strange, like they were hiding something important. The mystery deepened, but Jessica's parents were determined to crack it wide open. They couldn't give up, no matter how many dead ends they hit. A month had passed since Jessica disappeared, and despite their efforts, her family was no closer to the truth. Every lead had turned into a dead end. But then, just when they thought all hope was lost, a phone call changed everything. It was an anonymous tip. The caller claimed they had seen someone acting suspiciously the day Jessica vanished. The person they described was David Brooks, the neighbor who had been acting so strange since Jessica's disappearance. The caller said they had seen him near the woods that day, but when asked what he was doing, Brooks had just hurried away, looking nervous. The tip felt like it could be the breakthrough they'd been waiting for, but there was a catch. There was no proof. No one had seen anything concrete. It was just a vague description, and still, it wasn't enough to link him directly to Jessica's disappearance. But that phone call sparked something. Jessica's parents couldn't shake the feeling that they were getting closer, even if the evidence wasn't there yet. They knew they had to act quickly before whatever lead they had slipped through their fingers. So, the search started again. This time, investigators returned to Brooks's property, hoping they could find something, anything, that would tie him to Jessica. They combed through the land, checking every corner, every shed. They were meticulous, but when they finished, they came up empty. No new evidence, no signs of foul play. It felt like they were chasing shadows. But something about this didn't feel right. There had to be more to this. They couldn't ignore the fact that Brooks had been acting odd and avoiding the family. It wasn't just the tip. It was his behavior all along. The more they looked into him, the more they started to feel like there was something they were missing. His odd behavior, the strange phone calls, the way he seemed to vanish whenever Jessica's name came up. The pieces didn't quite fit, but they were starting to connect. Investigators began to question everything again, searching for the signs they might have missed before. There was a growing sense that they were getting closer, but it wasn't just about what they had found. It was the feeling that everything was finally starting to line up. The tip, Brooks's behavior, and the lack of answers, they all pointed in one direction. They couldn't give up now. The breakthrough was close, but it wasn't clear yet how everything would fall into place. Still, with every search and every question, they could feel the walls closing in on the truth. The investigation was about to take a new turn, and nothing would be the same again. The investigation had been dragging on for over 2 weeks with no major leads. The family was losing hope, and the police were running out of ideas. But then, a surprising tip came in. A tip that would change everything. It wasn't from a neighbor or a passerby who had seen something suspicious. This time, it came from an unlikely source. A prison inmate. The man had been serving time for an unrelated crime, but during a conversation, he revealed something shocking. He claimed that he knew who had murdered Jessica. At first, the authorities didn't know whether to trust him, but the details he shared were enough to make them take notice. The inmate told detectives that during his time in prison, he had shared a cell with someone who had confessed to the murder. The man who confessed was none other than Jessica's uncle, Stanley Dish. The truth hit like a ton of bricks. For all these years, Jessica's family had trusted Stanley. He had been there for them, a close family member they never suspected. But in that moment, everything they thought they knew came crashing down. Stanley had been hiding a dark secret for years, something no one could have imagined. The inmate revealed that Stanley had been abusing Jessica for a long time. He had been keeping this secret buried deep, and when Jessica threatened to expose him, he did the unthinkable. Stanley had murdered her to keep her quiet. And on that fateful day, September 10th, 1999, he had gone to her house while her parents were away. He demanded she break up with her boyfriend. When she refused, he snapped. The details of what happened next were beyond horrifying. Stanley attacked Jessica, restraining her with sheets and taking her to an abandoned shed not far from where her body would later be found. He kept her alive for several days, tormenting her. In the end, he strangled her, disposed of her body in a public place to throw off suspicion, and even tried to mislead the police by removing parts of her body. Jessica's family had no idea that Stanley, the person they trusted the most, was capable of such brutality. The shock and pain were unimaginable, but the final piece of the puzzle had fallen into place. The police now had a solid lead, proof that the person responsible for Jessica's death was someone they should have suspected all along. The authorities quickly moved to arrest Stanley, but he denied everything. He claimed he had nothing to do with Jessica's disappearance, but the evidence was mounting. They found a buried bedsheet, matching the ones from Jessica's bed, and other clues that linked him to the crime. It was clear now. Stanley was guilty. The trial was set, and the entire community was rocked by the revelation. How could a man, a family member, do something so terrible? Jessica's parents struggled to come to terms with the truth. Their brother had taken their daughter's life, and they hadn't seen it coming. As Stanley's trial approached, the prosecutors uncovered more about his past. They found that Stanley had a history of abusing young girls in the family, and his pattern of manipulation and threats had been going on for decades. He had used his charm to gain trust and get close to vulnerable family members, only to betray them in the worst way possible. Despite all the evidence, Stanley continued to deny his involvement in Jessica's murder. But the facts were clear. Stanley Dish was the one responsible for her death. The trial was difficult for the family, but in the end, the truth had been revealed. And although no amount of justice could bring Jessica back, it was a small step toward closure. Jessica's family had spent years in agony, never knowing the truth about what happened to her. But now they had answers. The real killer had been hiding in plain sight the whole time. The revelation of the truth hit Jessica's family like a freight train. To discover that their brother, Stanley, had taken their daughter's life was a wound no one could have prepared for. For years, they had lived with the uncertainty, the crushing weight of not knowing what happened. And now, to find out that the person they had trusted most, the person they never imagined would hurt anyone, was the one responsible for Jessica's death, shattered them. For Jessica's parents, the pain was unbearable. They couldn't even begin to process how someone they considered family, someone they had known their entire lives, could commit such a horrible act. How could Stanley, the man who had shared their meals, their holidays, their childhood memories, betray them in the worst way possible? The grief, anger, and betrayal were overwhelming. They felt as though their world had been turned upside down. The man who should have been a protector, a role model, had instead become their worst nightmare. The emotional toll on Jessica's family was impossible to ignore. Her parents, her siblings, they all struggled to make sense of it. They felt guilty for not seeing the signs, for not noticing the cracks in Stanley's behavior sooner. They asked themselves over and over again, could they have done more? Could they have stopped it before it happened? The weight of those questions followed them every day. And then, there was the sadness. The deep, aching sadness of losing Jessica, a daughter, a sister, a friend. The pain of knowing they had spent 15 years with no answers, no closure. And now, even with the truth out in the open, the hurt didn't go away. Justice, in some ways, felt hollow. Their daughter was gone, and nothing could bring her back. As for Stanley, after the inmate's confession and all the evidence that tied him to the crime, he was arrested. The trial that followed was long and painful. For Jessica's family, hearing all the details of what Stanley had done to her and how he had manipulated and abused her for years was like reliving the nightmare over and over again. In the end, Stanley was convicted. But for Jessica's parents, the conviction didn't feel like victory. It felt like a small piece of justice for their daughter. The damage had been done, and no punishment could heal the wounds. The legal system had failed them. Had the investigation been handled properly from the start, maybe Jessica's case wouldn't have taken 15 years to solve. Her parents couldn't help but wonder. Could they have saved their daughter if the police had taken their concerns seriously from the beginning? Could they have found her sooner if they hadn't dismissed her disappearance as just another runaway case? The failures in the investigation weighed heavily on them. It wasn't just the crime itself that tore them apart. It was the fact that it had been mishandled for so long. While Stanley's conviction gave some sense of closure, it was bittersweet. He was sentenced to prison, but the family had to live with the knowledge that the person they had trusted most was responsible for the death of someone they loved so deeply. No amount of prison time would undo the hurt, the loss, and the years of unanswered questions. Jessica's family tried to move forward, but the scars would never fully heal. The trauma of what happened would stay with them forever. The case may have been solved, but the pain of losing her never went away. They could only hope that others would learn from their experience, that more attention would be paid to missing person cases, and that the mistakes in Jessica's investigation would never be repeated. For Jessica, for their family, it was too late, but they wanted to make sure no one else had to go through what they did. In the end, the truth came out, but the cost was too high. They couldn't bring Jessica back, and no sentence could undo the damage. The emotional fallout from the case would last a lifetime. Even after all the years of searching, The truth that came out wasn't enough to give Jessica's family full peace. Yes, they finally knew what had happened, but the damage was done. The questions that remained still haunted them. Was there anyone else involved? Could someone have helped Stanley cover up his crime? Were there signs they missed all those years ago? Things they could have done differently to stop it from happening? The unanswered questions still lingered. Every step of the investigation had been full of mistakes, missed chances, and overlooked details. What if the police had acted faster? What if the investigation had been taken more seriously in the beginning? Could Jessica have been found alive? These questions weighed heavily on her family, even after the truth was uncovered. The closure they thought they'd get from finding out what happened was overshadowed by the years they had lost and the justice that came too late. And what about Stanley? He had been sentenced, but did he act alone? Was he the only one who knew what happened? Could someone else have been pulling strings in the background? These are questions that might never be fully answered, and that uncertainty can be just as unsettling as the crime itself. Jessica's family had to live with the truth, but the scars would never fade. The pain of losing a loved one and discovering it was someone so close to them was unimaginable. For them, justice wasn't just about what happened in the courtroom. It was about the years they spent without knowing what happened to their daughter. What do you think happened? Could there have been signs they missed earlier? Was there someone else involved in covering up the crime? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.
On the evening of May 15, 2023, Emily Walker, a 28-year-old woman with a bright future ahead, stepped into her kitchen for a casual conversation with her mom. But little did anyone know, this would be the last time they'd see her. After a short phone call, she disappeared without a trace. For 2 long years, her family waited for answers. They had no idea that the truth was just around the corner, waiting to be uncovered. It was a regular evening, one of those quiet moments between mother and daughter. The kind where time slows down, everything feels comfortable and familiar. Emily chatted with her mom about her day. Nothing unusual. But then as the minutes passed, Emily's phone rang. The call was short, but it changed everything. Emily's voice, which had been light and warm, suddenly shifted, though her mom didn't pick up on it during their conversation. She said a few quick words, hung up, and without much explanation, told her mom she had to leave. Her mother didn't think much of it. Emily was independent and often left on a whim. But this time, something felt off. Emily left, her footsteps fading into the night. Her mom watched her go, not realizing that those would be the last steps she'd ever see her daughter take. The next morning, Emily didn't return home. Her phone went straight to voicemail. No text, no call, just complete silence. As the hours turned into a day, then 2, and finally 3, Emily's sudden absence grew more worrying. At first, her family didn't jump to conclusions. Maybe she was staying with a friend or something came up. But as the days passed, the silence became unbearable. Her mother, Lorraine, grew more anxious with each passing hour. Emily would never go this long without at least checking in. Something wasn't right. It was as if Emily had simply disappeared, and in that emptiness, the dread that started as a small feeling began to grow louder. 4 days after Emily disappeared, Lorraine couldn't ignore the fear any longer. She was about to call the authorities when a knock at the door interrupted her. It was the police, and they had terrible news. Emily had been found, but it wasn't the relief they had hoped for. Emily's body had been discovered, floating by the banks of a remote river. But it wasn't just that she was found, it was how she was found. The evidence suggested something far darker was at play, and the case quickly took a terrifying turn. Emily's family grew more concerned as each day passed without any word from her. Her friends and co-workers were equally puzzled. Emily, who was always in touch, had stopped responding to messages and hadn't been active on social media. Her phone, which was usually full of texts and notifications, was silent. It was as though she had simply vanished. The detectives got to work, looking into every part of Emily's life they could. They started with her phone records, her social media, and anything she had communicated in the days leading up to her disappearance. Everything seemed normal, even ordinary. There were no signs that anything was wrong. Her messages were light and casual, and there was nothing unusual about her conversations. No troubling phone calls, no signs of conflict or distress, but there was one detail that stood out: the phone call. The records showed that on the night she disappeared, Emily had received a call from a number that they couldn't trace. It had no name, no address, just a series of random numbers. Emily had always been careful about who she communicated with, so it was strange that she would pick up an unknown call, and even stranger that it would be the last contact anyone had with her. The detectives tried every method they could to trace the number. They ran it through every database, checked with phone providers, and even looked for any potential connections. But nothing came up. The number seemed to have no history. The call was brief, lasting only a few seconds. There was no voicemail left behind. The call ended just as quickly as it began, leaving the detectives with more questions than answers. The lack of information around the call became their biggest lead. Who had called Emily and why? Why had she answered? And what was said in those few seconds? With no answers from the phone records, the detectives shifted their focus to people in Emily's life. Had she been involved with anyone who might have wanted to hurt her? Emily was known for being friendly, approachable, and well-liked. She didn't have any known enemies, and no one had mentioned anything that would suggest she was in danger. Her breakup with her ex-boyfriend had been amicable, and as far as anyone knew, there had been no tension or unresolved issues. Still, the detectives couldn't rule anything out. They started speaking with people who might have been on the outskirts of Emily's life: acquaintances, co-workers, even people she had met briefly. They hoped someone might have noticed something unusual, something that would help explain her disappearance. Mark, Emily's ex-boyfriend, was one of the first people they interviewed. He was clearly upset, and his answers seemed genuine. He told them that they had split months ago, but had stayed on good terms and would occasionally meet for coffee. He hadn't heard from her in the days before she went missing, nor had he been in contact with her afterward. His alibi checked out, and the detectives didn't find anything to suggest he was involved. With no solid leads, the detectives returned to the phone records, hoping they might have overlooked something. They ran the number again, trying to trace it through cell towers and different phone networks, but all their efforts led nowhere. The more they looked into it, the more frustrating it became. The phone call was their only lead, and it was as elusive as Emily herself. Whoever had made that call had managed to cover their tracks. The detectives were no closer to finding an answer. The question still haunted them. Why had Emily been called? And more importantly, who had called her? 2 years had passed since Emily Walker disappeared, and her family was running out of hope. They'd tried everything: posting flyers, speaking with anyone who might have seen something, and keeping the case alive. But still, no answers. The silence was unbearable, and each day without progress only deepened their worry. Emily's family had endured long months of wondering where she was and what had happened, holding on to the faintest hope that one day the truth would come to light. Then on the second anniversary of Emily's disappearance, a surprising turn of events brought some light to the darkness. A man named David Thompson, who lived just a few blocks from Emily's house, came forward with something he had kept to himself until then. He had seen something that night that he hadn't been able to forget, and now he realized it might be the key to finding out what happened to Emily. David told the police that on the night Emily disappeared, he had been at home when he noticed her standing outside, talking to someone by the side of the road. There was a dark car parked near her, and she seemed to be speaking with the person in the car. David couldn't make out much of the conversation, but something about the situation stood out to him. He kept watching for a moment, but when he moved to get a better look, the car had already sped off, disappearing down the street. At the time, David didn't think much of it. It seemed like a casual conversation between two people, but now with everything that had happened, he realized it could be important. He had never come forward before because he hadn't believed his observation would matter. But after 2 years of silence, he knew he had to say something. David contacted the detectives, telling them everything he remembered about that night. The information wasn't much: a brief interaction, a dark car, a man David couldn't recognize. But it was something no one else had provided. The detectives took David's account seriously and began following up on the details he had given them. They revisited the area around Emily's house, trying to piece together a clearer timeline of what had happened. The car David had seen seemed to match a vehicle spotted in nearby surveillance footage, and this new lead gave them hope. As they continued their investigation, they reached out to people in the neighborhood, hoping to find someone who might have seen something else that night. Some neighbors recalled seeing the dark car parked on the street, while others remembered hearing a brief conversation between two people, though no one had thought it was unusual at the time. Despite these small clues falling into place, the identity of the man Emily had spoken to remained unknown. The detectives now had a fresh lead to follow, and the case began to shift in a new direction. Instead of focusing solely on Emily's past relationships, they now had to look into the stranger in the dark car. David's information had opened up a new avenue for the investigation. The detectives expanded their search, looking for any records that might match the description of the car or the man. They checked with local authorities, ran background checks, and combed through old reports. They kept searching, hoping that each new step would bring them closer to identifying who had been with Emily that night. Even though they still had no clear answers, the detectives could feel that they were on the right track. The case no longer seemed like an unsolvable mystery. With new details to follow, they had a renewed sense of purpose. Emily's family, though still devastated, felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in months. The clock had ticked on for 2 years, but now, with fresh eyes on the case, they could finally start to see a way forward. Detectives tracked down the registration of the car seen near Emily on the night she disappeared. To everyone's surprise, it was registered to Emily's ex-boyfriend, Brian Miller. Until now, his name had never come up in the investigation. Brian had always stayed in the background of Emily's life. They had been in an on and off relationship for over a year, but they had broken up months before she went missing. From the outside, it seemed like a clean break. They had ended things, and both had moved on. Or so it seemed. But as detectives looked more closely at Brian, they found things they hadn't expected. Brian wasn't as distant from Emily's life as everyone thought. He had a habit of being controlling during their relationship. He would often check in on her, ask where she was, and who she was with. While Emily never mentioned anything serious about it to her family, those who knew her said Brian could be overbearing at times. The detectives soon found that Brian had tried to contact Emily in the weeks before she vanished. It wasn't just a casual message here and there. It became clear he was trying to get back into her life. At first, it seemed like simple check-ins, but the more they looked, the more it appeared Brian was unwilling to let go of the relationship. Emily had moved on, but Brian's feelings hadn't faded. This revelation changed everything. The breakup that had seemed final now looked much more complicated. Emily's family had no idea that Brian's attempts to reconnect with her had continued long after they thought the relationship was over. It made the detectives question whether his feelings for Emily played a part in her disappearance. With this new information, everything started to make sense. The picture of Emily's life, which had seemed clear, suddenly had a dark spot in the middle of it. Emily's disappearance no longer seemed like a random event. It felt more like a situation that had been building quietly under the surface, with Brian being at the center of it. As the investigation continued, the police found some surprising evidence at Brian Miller's house. Among the things they discovered were photos of Emily, some from when they were together and others taken after their breakup. There were also letters, some that Emily had written to Brian, and some that he had kept hidden, ones she never received. One of the most important finds was an old phone. It wasn't just any phone, it had messages from Emily, sent just days before she vanished. The messages were short, nothing that stood out, but they showed that Emily had still been in contact with Brian. This wasn't the first time the detectives realized that Brian hadn't truly let go of Emily. As they looked into it further, they discovered that Brian had been trying to reach out to Emily for a long time. He had sent her multiple messages in the months leading up to her disappearance, but Emily had ignored them. She had made it clear that their relationship was over, but Brian didn't accept that. He kept pushing, trying to get her back, and it became clear that he had been planning to force her to reconnect with him. When the detectives pieced everything together, they found that on the night Emily disappeared, Brian had contacted her, pretending to want closure. Emily, wanting to move forward with her life, agreed to meet him, thinking it would help her get past their past. But Brian had other plans. He took her to a secluded area, away from everything she knew. Once they were there, Brian attacked her. In a moment of rage, he took her life. Emily, who had hoped to put her past behind her, became the victim of someone who couldn't accept the end of their relationship. On August 5th, 2025, Brian Miller was arrested. When the police questioned him, he confessed to the crime. He admitted that he had killed Emily that night after convincing her to meet him. He had been trying to force her to return to him for months, and when that didn't happen, he chose to end it in the most tragic way possible. With Brian's confession, the case was finally solved. The long wait for answers was over, and Emily's family could finally start to find some closure. Emily Walker's story is one of heartbreak and loss. Her family will never fully recover from the pain of her absence, but they now have the truth, something they had longed for since the day she disappeared. 2 years of uncertainty, of questions that seemed impossible to answer, finally gave way to the truth. It's a painful reminder that sometimes justice comes after a long wait. Though the tragedy can never be undone, Emily's family can begin to heal, knowing what really happened that night. This story serves as a reminder that even when it feels like the answers will never come, there is always hope. In the end, the truth has a way of finding its way to the surface, even if it takes time.
In the small town of Darden, Tennessee, life was calm, quiet, and predictable. But one morning, everything changed. Holly Bobo, a 20-year-old nursing student, disappeared without a trace. What started as a typical day quickly turned into a nightmare, and no one could explain where she had gone. As the days passed, the search for Holly only raised more questions. Who took her? What happened in those final moments? The mystery would drag on for years, and when the truth was finally uncovered, it was more shocking than anyone could have imagined. Holly Bobo was a 20-year-old nursing student, full of hope and ambition. She grew up in Darden, a small town in Tennessee, a place where everyone knew everyone, and life moved at a slow, steady pace. Darden was the kind of town where doors were left unlocked and neighbors greeted each other with a smile. For Holly, it was the perfect place to grow up. Surrounded by woods and streams, she loved spending time outdoors with her family. Her parents, her brother, and Holly were close-knit, always making time for one another. Holly wasn't just known for her love of nature. She had a beautiful voice that could light up any room, often singing at her local church. But more than anything, she dreamed of becoming a nurse, a career that matched her caring nature. She wasn't just looking for a job. She wanted to make a real difference in people's lives. The future looked bright for Holly. With a loving family and a promising career path, everything seemed in place. She had her whole life ahead of her. But on the morning of April 13th, 2011, everything changed. What was supposed to be a normal day turned into something unthinkable. Holly's sudden disappearance rattled the whole town. A place that once felt so safe became filled with questions and fear. Friends, neighbors, and family couldn't understand how something like this could happen in their small, peaceful town. The community was left in shock. The people who had known Holly her whole life struggled to make sense of what had happened. How could someone just vanish? The quiet streets, once filled with the sounds of children playing and neighbors chatting, now seemed eerie and silent. It wasn't just Holly's family that was shaken. This was a loss that affected everyone who knew her. The loss of Holly felt like a blow to the heart of the community, and the unsettling silence only deepened the fear. What had happened to her? And who could have taken her? April 13th, 2011, started just like any other morning for Holly Bobo. She woke up early, just before 5 a.m., and got ready for the day ahead. She had breakfast, reviewed her notes for university, and prepared herself for a normal day of classes. Holly lived at home with her parents in Darden, a quiet rural town where everyone knew each other. It was just a short drive to the University of Tennessee, where Holly was studying nursing, following her dream to help others. By the time Holly's parents left for work around 7:30 a.m., Holly was preparing to head out herself. She decided to call her boyfriend. They spoke briefly about his plans to go hunting that day on land owned by her grandmother. He just wanted to make sure it was okay with her family. Holly reassured him, told him she had to leave soon, and hung up. But that wasn't the end of it. At that exact moment, something strange happened. A neighbor, standing outside to start his day, heard a loud scream coming from Holly's house. The scream was sharp, and it didn't sound right. Alarmed, he called his mother. She immediately called Holly's mom at work, who, already feeling uneasy, tried calling her daughter. No answer. The fear started to set in, and Holly's mom rushed home. She had a bad feeling, and it only got worse when her calls to Holly went unanswered. Holly's brother, still asleep at the time, had no idea what was going on until he heard their dog barking uncontrollably from the backyard. He looked out of the window, thinking maybe the dog saw something. At first, he didn't see anything unusual, but then his heart sank. He saw Holly standing in the garage with a man. At first, he thought it was her boyfriend, but something didn't feel right. The man was wearing full camouflage gear, and he was much taller than Holly's boyfriend. It didn't take long for Holly's brother to sense that something was wrong. His gut told him this wasn't a normal situation. He quickly tried to call his mother, wanting to check if Holly had changed her plans or if her boyfriend was visiting. But before he could ask, his mother's frantic voice interrupted him. She told him, "That's not her boyfriend. You need to grab a gun." Confused and scared, Holly's brother quickly understood the gravity of the situation. He rushed outside, trying to figure out what was going on. When he looked again, he saw Holly walking towards the woods, the mysterious man holding her hand tightly. It was clear now. This wasn't a friendly visit. Holly's brother's panic reached new heights. He desperately called her, but there was no response. His calls to her boyfriend went unanswered as well. That was the last time anyone saw Holly. In those moments, as her brother watched in horror, Holly and the strange man disappeared into the woods. All that was left was a feeling of dread, confusion, and helplessness. Holly's brother ran inside, screaming for help, and by the time he got back to the house, he found blood in the garage. A shocking sign that something terrible had happened. It was too late. Holly had vanished, and no one knew where she was or why she had been taken. The mystery had begun. When Holly's brother saw her walk into the woods with a stranger, his heart dropped. He ran inside to tell his mother, and she immediately called the police. But it didn't take long for the family to realize that the clock was ticking, and the local police weren't acting fast enough. Holly's mother rushed home from work, but by the time she got there, the situation was already critical. The police arrived, but their response felt more like confusion than urgency. They didn't immediately secure the area or search the woods, even though Holly had been seen walking in that direction with an unknown man. The officers weren't sure what to do. As the minutes turned into hours, the frustration grew. The family was desperate, and yet it felt like the police were just going through the motions. They didn't even question the neighbors who could have been key witnesses, people who may have seen or heard something important. The family couldn't understand why the investigation wasn't moving faster. It wasn't until hours later that the search for Holly really began, and even then, it was slow. The police didn't even search the woods until after the sun had set, and by then, the hours lost could have made all the difference. The family's anxiety mounted with every passing minute. They knew something terrible had happened, but the authorities weren't giving them any answers. Holly's mom couldn't sit idly by, watching the police do little to help. Her daughter was out there, and she was running out of time. The most frustrating part was how the police dismissed key details that Holly's brother had observed. They didn't take him seriously enough when he explained what he saw, the stranger, the way he held Holly's hand, and the fact that he wasn't Holly's boyfriend. Despite these clear clues, the police were slow to react. They didn't even secure Holly's house properly or collect potential evidence that could have helped. Every call made to law enforcement felt like a battle. The family begged for action, but it was as if they were fighting a system that wasn't equipped for this kind of crisis. While Holly's family fought for her safety, the town's small police force seemed helpless, too overwhelmed to act fast enough. Holly's parents, frustrated and terrified, decided to take matters into their own hands. They pushed for a wider search, calling in volunteers, friends, and neighbors. The pressure on the authorities was mounting, but the lack of a quick response left the family feeling more hopeless by the hour. It was clear to everyone around them. If the police had acted quicker, things could have been different. Months had passed since Holly vanished, and the search for her seemed to grow colder by the day. Her family clung to hope, but the lack of answers from the police left them feeling lost and frustrated. Just as everyone began to fear that they might never find out what happened, something happened in the woods that would change everything. It was September 2014, 3 long years after Holly's disappearance, when a group of hunters made an unexpected and chilling discovery deep in the forest. They were out exploring a remote part of the woods, about 19 miles from Holly's family home, when they came across something unusual, something that would haunt them forever. Hidden in the underbrush, partially covered by thick foliage, was a large, oddly placed bucket. The hunters were curious but also cautious. There was something about the scene that didn't sit right with them. As they moved closer, one of them peered inside. The moment his eyes fell on the contents, he froze in horror. Inside the bucket were remains. The hunters quickly realized the magnitude of what they had just found. It was clear that this was no ordinary discovery. They knew they had to act fast. Immediately, they contacted the authorities, and soon, law enforcement arrived at the scene to secure and investigate the evidence. The forensic team worked tirelessly, carefully examining every detail of the remains. It took several days for them to confirm what everyone had feared. The remains were, in fact, those of Holly Bobo. Using dental records, they were able to identify her for certain. The discovery was heartbreaking, but it also marked a turning point in the case. The evidence found in the woods was the key to unlocking a 3-year-old mystery. The forensic team's work didn't end there. With every piece of evidence they uncovered, it became clear that Holly's last moments were more disturbing than anyone had imagined. There were signs of trauma, a clear indication that she hadn't left her home willingly. The details were too much to process, too unsettling to think about. But with the confirmation of Holly's remains came another piece of the puzzle: new suspects. The investigators turned their attention back to the details that had emerged early on in the case. Holly's brother had seen her with a stranger on the morning of her disappearance, a man dressed in camouflage. The man was tall, with long dark hair, a detail that stood out to him, but wasn't enough to identify the man at the time. As the investigation shifted gears, law enforcement began to focus on those who might fit the description. A local man named Zach Adams soon became a prime suspect. His physical appearance matched the description of the man Holly's brother had seen. Zach, a known figure in the community, had a criminal record that only deepened the suspicion. His past was filled with troubling behavior, but at first, there was no direct evidence connecting him to Holly's abduction. Still, the investigators pressed on. They re-examined every detail of the case, looking for any small clue that could lead them to the truth. As the pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place, it was clear that Holly's abduction wasn't a random act. Someone had planned this, someone who knew what they were doing. And while the discovery of her remains was a breakthrough, it was only the beginning of a long and painful unraveling. After Holly Bobo's disappearance, the whole town of Darden was turned upside down. Her family couldn't believe it. Holly had simply vanished, and no one knew where she was or why. The emotional toll on her parents and brother was overwhelming. They tried to stay strong, but the constant uncertainty and fear took a huge toll on them. Every phone call, every knock at the door brought hope that someone would finally have answers. But as the days went by, that hope started to fade. Holly's mom and dad were beside themselves. They couldn't understand how their daughter, who had always been so careful, could have just disappeared. They spent sleepless nights trying to figure out what had happened, replaying the events of that morning over and over in their minds, looking for any clue they might have missed. Holly's brother, still haunted by what he had seen, was consumed with guilt. He kept asking himself, was there something he could have done? Could he have stopped it? As the days stretched into weeks, the small town, once peaceful and quiet, became a place of constant tension. The streets that used to feel so safe now felt empty. The sense of calm was replaced by fear. What had happened to Holly? Why was she taken? But in the midst of the growing darkness, the community didn't give up. They banded together, organizing search parties and posting flyers everywhere they could. Neighbors who barely knew each other now worked side by side, combing the woods, hoping to find anything that would lead them to Holly. The whole town seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for answers. Then something strange started to happen. Holly's belongings began to turn up, scattered across town in random places. Her lunchbox was found abandoned on the street. Then her ID card was discovered, lying in a local park. People started talking. Was Holly still out there? Had she left these things behind as a clue? A desperate cry for help? Or was someone planting them, trying to mislead everyone and keep them guessing? The items kept appearing, adding more confusion than clarity. It was as if the town was caught in a twisted game, one that no one understood. Was Holly alive? Had she managed to escape? Or was something else at play, something far darker? The random discoveries of her personal things only deepened the mystery, and the urgency to find her grew stronger. As the investigation dragged on, the police began to focus on one man in particular, Terry, a local man with a violent past. Terry wasn't exactly a stranger to the law. He had been arrested several times before, his history marked by assault charges and troubling behavior. The police were eager to investigate him, believing that his violent tendencies might have played a role in Holly's disappearance. There were some strange coincidences that made him look suspicious. Terry had been seen in the area around the time Holly vanished, and he fit the description of the kind of person who could have taken her. He was known to hang out in the same areas where Holly's family lived. With his past and the troubling signs, it seemed like he could be the person responsible. But when investigators dug deeper, the evidence just wasn't there. They couldn't link Terry to Holly's disappearance. No one could say for sure whether he was even in the area when she was taken. Even his alibi, though shaky, seemed to hold up, and no physical evidence tied him to the scene. The frustration was mounting. The investigators had focused on him for so long, and now they had nothing. They were back at square one. But then, out of nowhere, came a bombshell. Dylan Adams, a man with deep ties to the family, stepped forward with information that would change everything. Dylan wasn't just another person involved in the community. He was part of a local family with connections to both the victim and the suspects. His sudden involvement made everyone take a step back. The moment he spoke, people listened. Dylan claimed he had knowledge about Holly's abduction, and what he revealed shocked everyone. For so long, it had seemed like the case was going nowhere. But now, this unexpected confession opened a new door, one that would lead to more answers and even more questions. It was the twist the investigation needed, but no one knew what it would uncover or just how much more complicated things were about to become. The discovery of Terry's possible involvement might have led nowhere, but Dylan's confession hinted at something far darker, a web of connections and secrets that no one had seen coming. And as the investigation pressed forward, the true story began to slowly come into focus, one that would unravel everything they thought they knew. The investigation into Holly Bobo's disappearance had been stalled for months. There were countless dead ends, frustrating leads that led nowhere. But then, in March 2014, the police received a shocking phone call. Dylan Adams, the brother of a key suspect, stepped forward with a confession that no one saw coming. Dylan claimed he had information that could change everything. He said he had seen Holly alive after her abduction. This revelation sent shockwaves through the entire investigation. For years, everyone had been wondering if Holly was still alive, and now, this man, who had deep ties to the community and the suspects, was saying he had witnessed her. He described the scene. Holly was alive, but terrified, sitting rigidly in a chair, her face filled with fear. Dylan's confession wasn't just a bombshell, it was a game changer. The room where he saw Holly was described as eerily quiet, the kind of place where time seemed to stand still. He mentioned his brother, Zach, casually revealing that he had kidnapped Holly and that things had taken a terrible turn. Dylan claimed Zach had assaulted Holly and filmed the horrific act, something Dylan could not forget. The psychological toll of Dylan's statement hit everyone hard. His words felt like a weight, burdening the investigation in ways that hadn't been seen before. He was clearly conflicted. His guilt was impossible to ignore. While he insisted he hadn't directly participated in the crime, the fact that he had witnessed Holly in such a state and done nothing to stop it haunted him. For weeks, his confession became the center of the investigation, and his complex emotions of fear and guilt left investigators and the public questioning just how much he really knew, and how much he was hiding. Dylan's confession pushed the case forward, but it also made it more complicated. His connection to the crime wasn't just about what he saw, it was about what he didn't say. His confession shattered the illusion that the case was straightforward. Holly was no longer just a missing person. She had become the center of a twisted web of secrets, lies, and guilt. Dylan's revelation changed everything, and the investigation would never be the same again. As the case moved forward, it became clear that the trial of Zach Adams would be one of the most high-stakes moments in this long and painful journey for justice. Zach, who had denied any involvement in Holly's disappearance, was now facing mounting evidence that pointed directly at him. His defense tried to deny the accusations, but the evidence, combined with Dylan's confession, was too much to ignore. Zach's stance was clear. He would never admit guilt. His defiance was evident throughout the trial. He maintained that he was innocent, even as his family's secrets were exposed. His brother Dylan's testimony became a central part of the prosecution's case, revealing not just Zach's involvement in Holly's abduction, but also his actions after the crime. The prosecution painted a picture of Zach as someone who manipulated and controlled the situation, someone who had taken Holly with premeditation and brutality. Jason, a key witness and close acquaintance to Zach, also played a crucial role. His testimony painted a dark and disturbing picture of the events leading up to Holly's abduction. He described how Zach and Dylan had tried to involve him in their plans, with Zach admitting to the crime, even casually mentioning it as if it were an afterthought. Jason's account threatened to unravel Zach's entire defense, painting him as not just a bystander, but a central figure in Holly's tragic fate. But even with all the evidence, the courtroom was far from predictable. As the defense continued to fight tooth and nail, they highlighted the inconsistencies in the testimonies and questioned the reliability of Jason's account. Zach's lawyer painted him as a victim of circumstance, someone wrongfully accused by a biased investigation. The tension was high. Everyone knew the case was headed for a verdict, but no one could predict what it would be. Would Zach's defiance hold up in court, or would the truth finally come to light? The courtroom was electric with anticipation. The defense did everything it could to tear apart the prosecution's case, but with each passing day, the evidence piled up. It was clear. Zach's lies were starting to crumble. His fate was sealed when the jury returned with a guilty verdict. Zach Adams was convicted for the kidnapping, assault, and murder of Holly Bobo. The emotional release in the courtroom was overwhelming. Finally, after years of pain and unanswered questions, justice was served. But the story wasn't over. Dylan, who had confessed to his role in the crime, opted for a plea deal. He admitted his part in the events, but stopped short of revealing everything. His plea deal spared him a harsher sentence, but it left lingering doubts about the full extent of his involvement. The deal allowed him to testify against Zach, but it didn't provide the kind of closure the community had hoped for. Still, it was a step toward bringing the truth to light. Holly's family had endured years of heartache, not knowing what had happened to their daughter. The trial, with its twists and turns, gave them some semblance of justice. But even with Zach's conviction, the psychological toll remained. The courtroom drama was over, but the emotional scars of Holly's death would linger for everyone involved. The family would never forget what they had lost, and the town of Darden would forever be changed by the dark events that unfolded. Holly Bobo's story isn't just a tragedy. It's a painful reminder of how quickly a quiet, peaceful life can be turned upside down. For her family, this ordeal has left lasting scars. They had to endure years of uncertainty, endless waiting, and the weight of not knowing what happened to their daughter. And the community of Darden, once a place where people felt safe, will never be the same again. The twists and turns in this case, from the slow response of the police to the shocking confessions and the trial, show how complex the truth can be. It took years to find Holly's remains, and even longer to get justice for her. But despite everything, the strength and determination of her family and the community's tireless efforts brought Holly's story to a close. The truth was finally out, even though it came with a heavy price. This case will stay with us for a long time. It makes you think about how vulnerable we all are and how important it is to never stop looking for answers. Holly's family may have found some peace, but the pain of losing a loved one this way will never truly fade. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think about the twists in this case? And if you want to hear more true crime stories like this one, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. You won't want to miss the next gripping investigation.